Hello, class. Welcome back. Talking about our topic point 4 through topic 1 notes. We left off here with the Civil War. We want to make sure we distinguish what were some of the advantages for the North and advantages for the South in the war. The majority of the advantages did go to the North. First of all, almost all manufacturing in the third or in the North and South happened in the North. Most of the major metropolitan areas were in the North because of an influx of immigration labor into northern cities. So that meant that if they needed more muskets or more rifles, they could make those. If they needed more train cars, they could make them. If they needed more supplies, they were much easier to be produced in mass in the North than in the South. Number 3, they had more supplies, because they had the manufacturing, meant they had more guns, they had more ammunition, they had more uniforms, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it made organization a much easier thing for the North than the South. You had medical supplies in the North and the South was unable to obtain because the North could manufacture them. A lot of the agriculture, such as wheat, corn, other grains were being produced in the North, not in the South. So the South had a shortage of food. It's not like the North had a massive supply of food. They just had more food. They also had a navy. The South didn't really even have much of a navy, which was a major advantage for the North in number 5 when we get to it. Number 4, they had railroads, which made transportation of their resources and troops much easier in the North compared to the South. And obviously the reason they had more railroads was because they had those big cities and manufacturing, so they could trade between cities and ship supplies and food around the North. The South had a lot fewer railroads because it was largely agricultural. So you'd have to have a train that could take the cotton from the plantation to the coast. But beyond that, you didn't need a really wide, diverse system of trains and railroads. For the Navy, the North could do what they called the Anaconda Plan, which is essentially a blockade. They used their Navy, as you can see in the image, to surround major southern ports to prevent the shipments from Europeans to supply them with the guns and ammunition and food and supplies that they had to get from outside of the country, simply because the North wasn't going to provide those for them. So they had to go to other countries, mainly European countries. The North could blockade those ports and prevent those goods from getting to the South, making it even more difficult for the South. And lastly, just simply, they had a massive population in the North compared to the South. So they had more men to choose from. They had more people to stay home and work and produce things than in the South. The South had to find every able-bodied man to get up and fight. The North could be a little more selective and, hopefully find more youthful soldiers. Now, the South definitely had some major advantages, though. One, they were highly motivated. They felt like their way of life was being threatened, just like when we fought the Revolutionary War against the British because they were coming in and taking away our rights. Southerners felt like the election of Abraham Lincoln was inevitably going to take away their rights to own slaves and their state's sovereignty to make laws that were best for their independent states. We look at that today and we say, well, that's a bad reason to declare independence. But in 1861, it was a good reason for them to declare independence in their eyes, because you always have to put history in perspective. What was life like back then? Slaves were considered a necessity, not something that was a moral, impropriety. Number 2, they were led by better officers. You had officers like Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, that were some of the top graduates from West Point, which was in the North. So you had highly trained officers that ran a much better garrison of troops than Northern generals did. And 3, they were fighting a defensive war. This could be a disadvantage or an advantage. The advantage is if I'm fighting to protect my home, and I'm fighting to protect my wife and children and my property, I'm going to fight a little harder. I have something more to fight for instead of going off to a different territory that's not recognizable to you and fighting there. It's a negative, too, because when you lose a battle, that's your home getting burned to the ground. That's your livestock getting slaughtered in the field. That's your field of cotton getting burned by the Northern troops. So that's a negative. The positive is it means you have more to fight for. You're more motivated. Last thing on this slide, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, which Abraham Lincoln delivers after the war has began in 1863. Now, it's often misconstrued that this speech freed the slaves. It only freed the slaves in states of rebellion. Abraham Lincoln did not free slaves in what we called the border states that were fighting for the Union. Why not? Because he knew that if he freed those slaves, it might push those border states to go join the Confederacy and leave the Union. Abraham Lincoln's major goal in fighting the Civil War was not to end slavery. Large misconception that he wanted to end slavery that badly. He wanted to preserve the Union. He said, if I could not free a single slave and preserve the Union, I would do so. So he understood the importance of preserving the Union over ending slavery. But once the war had already started and once it was obvious we were going to have to fight this war, you have to end slavery. The war is being fought over the states' rights to own slaves. So it was a justification for him to then go ahead and do what was right in history. So here's the Emancipation Proclamation. It's something that we'll read and analyze in class. If you are taking your notes on your own, I'd love for you to read through this and answer some of those questions as you go through it. Okay, next, the Civil War being fought. In 8th grade, you guys covered this really in depth. We are covering it in a matter of only a handful of slides here. So we're obviously not doing the war justice. It's a horribly bloody war. It's the first war fought with rifled guns, which means much more accurate shooting, but they're still using the same techniques used in the Mexican-American War and the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War, where you're lining up defensive lines and firing shots back and forth at each other. So extraordinarily bloody war. First thing we have on here is habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is your right to know the charges against you and go before a judge to understand those charges. President Lincoln is the only president in the history of the United States to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. What that means is that Northern journalists and Northern citizens that were Southern sympathizers saying, I understand why the South is seceding, I understand Lincoln is going beyond his power as president, he would have those people arrested. Holy cow. He would put them in jail without a trial and without knowing the charges against them to preserve the Union once again. So some people look back at this and say Abraham Lincoln way exceeded his power as president of the United States when he suspended habeas corpus. Others say this was absolutely necessary for him to preserve the Union. Next, we have the Battle of Gettysburg. This is one of the bloodiest battles in history. It is the bloodiest battle that American soldiers ever fought in. 50,000 men fought and died in the Battle of Gettysburg. The turning point is when the North wins the Battle of Gettysburg. In the entire war, General Lee is forced to retreat back into the South. This ends any sort of offensive effort by the South into the North, and it forces them to retreat back in the South. And the rest of the war is fought in the South, including General Sherman's march to the sea. General William Tecumseh Sherman was responsible for starting at the Mississippi River and putting pressure on the Confederate troops towards the Atlantic coast. It also separated them from a lot of their supplies that were coming from the west when we took control of the Mississippi River. So Sherman takes control of the Mississippi River, and then he continues to march to the sea. And in this march to the sea, we're seeing what's called total warfare. Okay? Total warfare is where you're not just fighting battles against troops, you're destroying everything in your path to morally bankrupt your opponent. So they're tearing up railroad ties as they go through. So the railroads are unusable after they pass through a town. They're burning down barns with livestock inside, with horses and hogs and sheep inside of it to destroy any opportunity to make a profit. They're going through and they're burning fields of indigo or tobacco or cotton as they travel through the South, ruining any opportunity to make money off of those cash crops. They're setting slaves free as they go through and try to provide relief for those newly freed slaves. So they do this all the way across, and it absolutely destroys the South. It absolutely destroys their infrastructure, their roads, their bridges, everything. But it also destroys their economy. It destroys their morale to realize we cannot let the entire South burn. But William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea also means that reconstruction is much more expensive. And we'll pick up here in our next episode. Thanks.